My name is Jan Harzan. I'm the Executive Director for MUFON. We are a scientific research organization that basically collects sighting reports from the public and then goes and investigates them. Our mission statement as an organization is the scientific study of UFOs for the benefit of humanity, and we have three primary goals. We investigate UFO reports, we promote research into the UFO subject, and we educate the public on our findings. We have 3,000 members worldwide. Many scientists, physicists, PhDs, metallurgists, biologists, all the way down to just the average citizen who really wants to get involved. Some of those have chosen to become field investigators, and they go through our field investigative training courses. They become part of the team in their state or country where they reside, and they actually get engaged in going out and meeting this phenomena head on. We've recently formed a science review board, and that board is made up of scientists from around the United States and around the world to review some of our more significant cases and try to render an opinion on them. What we'd like to do is be more outbound, more outspoken in terms of the really true UFO cases. So MUFON is moving forward with this approach, and we'll be publishing papers in these different areas to allow the general public and even the scientific community to be able to be challenged by what we're finding. That's the strength of MUFON as an organization, is being really the truth seekers of the UFO field.
Good morning. Our speaker, Dr. Ted Peters, is the author of UFOs, God's Chariots, Flying Saucers in Politics, Science, and Religion. He teaches theology at in Berkeley, California, at the Graduate Theological Union, where he co-edits the journal Theology and Science on behalf of the Center for Theology and Natural Sciences. He has been a member of MUFON for 35 years and once served as the Louisiana State Director, and has recently served as consultant to NASA and SETI on the Ethics of Planetary Protection. Please allow me to welcome to the stage Dr. Ted Peters.
Well, good morning. I like the fact that it's early in the morning. Otherwise, it's risky for you to have a professor talk to you. You know the definition of a professor. That's a person who talks in somebody else's sleep. Science, SETI, and UFOlogy as part, my topic as part of the theme here of understanding the work of MUFON and the field of ufology in terms of the scientific accent and the scientific commitments that we make. And I would like to deal with the question of what is the nature of science as applied to the question of extraterrestrial life in general, which would include those of us within ufology who are concerned about that, as well as other sciences, most particularly those at the SETI Institute. Here's the question I'm going to ask today. Why is it that scientists of the type that we find at SETI or NASA don't show up at the same barbecues with the ufologists? I think maybe they should. They have a lot more in common than some people want to admit. In Berkeley, as John said, I'm a theologian, and I work with the Center for Theology and the Natural Sciences there. There are two professors who are principals, and my colleague Bob Russell, who has a Ph.D. in physics. He's very concerned about cosmology and the question of extraterrestrial life, but wants to stay miles away from UFOs. He says, Ted, you can go do your UFO thing, but don't talk to me about it. Well, why not? Well, because we have to have a credible image with the scientific community. Well, just think about that a little bit. A credible image with the scientific community. What's going on there? One of the reasons why excitement is building over the question of extraterrestrial life is that since the late 1990s, we have been discovering exoplanets. Last I saw, perhaps 3,000 candidates with maybe confirmation between 900 and 1,000 that they're there. And with every discovery that happens a few times a month, we wonder, could this be the Goldilocks planet in the habitable zone where we have water and we have the conditions ripe for life? So this is a topic that we're all concerned about, even though ufologists have been concerned about it since the late 1940s. Who are the scientists that I'll be talking about? Astrobiologists primarily, but their colleagues, the astrophysicists, the astronomers, other space researchers, NASA, but primarily SETI, which you're probably familiar with, stands for the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence Institute, and their primary method is to listen for radio signals, or radio astronomy is their method for pursuing the search for off-Earth intelligence. There is a basic assumption at work in astrobiology, an assumption that most SETI researchers also make, and this will be the focus of what we're going to say in the next few minutes. This is Chris Impey, who heads the astrobiological project at the University of Arizona in Tucson, and it's the assumption that evolution leads to life, and then it leads to intelligence, and it leads to science and technology. And in Chris's words, since we, that's us on Earth, since we've only just attained the capability for space travel and communication, any civilization we encounter is likely to be far more advanced than we. That's an assumption. It is not a conclusion. My question is this a valid assumption or not? And obviously, by posing it this way, I think it's a very questionable assumption. Have you heard of the Fermi paradox? I bet you have. Try to imagine yourself on a sunshiny day, 1950, Los Alamos National Laboratories, and you're having an early lunch with Enrico Fermi, the great physicist, and Fermi is reading the newspaper, and of course the only newspaper you'd want to read in Los Alamos is the New York Times. And there is a series of stories running day after day for a while about garbage cans missing. Where are those garbage cans going? And each day you get another installment about this mystery. Well, in addition, there are articles in the Times about flying saucer sightings. And on one day, a cartoonist draws Fermi's attention, and you can see it's the aliens. They're stealing the garbage cans. So Fermi gets out a piece of paper and he starts scribbling some numbers about the known age of the universe, the amount of time it might take for life to develop, the amount of time it would take to evolve. And he says, where are they? Space should have traffic jams of traveling intelligent beings out there. Why are they not there? So we've come to call this the Fermi paradox. If that assumption that Chris Impey makes were valid, then we would expect space to be filled with traffic from intelligent beings, but they're not there. Fermi paradox. Well, Frank Drake believes that he has a way of formulating a research program in which we can work on this. 1960, he formulates what we now know of as the Drake equation. Note how he relies upon that assumption about evolution I mentioned a little while ago. He starts with the Milky Way. Why not those other galaxies? Well, they're just too far away to imagine communication. The Milky Way is big, 100 to 400 billion stars. I remember having a conversation with Charlie Towns, the cosmologist, about a year and a half ago. I said, Charlie, how many stars are there in the Milky Way? Is there 100 billion? Is there 200 billion? Is there 400 billion? And Charlie says, oh, that's about right. I said, wait a minute, Charlie, I want to know how many there are. He says, what do you want me to do, count them? And it appears as though finally somebody's decided to count them and the number is not in. So we start with a number of stars in the Milky Way, and we take the fraction of those stars that might have planets or that do have planets. We take the number of planets per star, and then the fraction of those planets where life begins and evolves, then the fraction of where intelligent life evolves, and then we take the fraction of those intelligent species that can communicate, at least communicate through space, and then because there are only a certain period of time in which a given planet can support life, we have to watch the calendar, and would the time in which an off-Earth planet and Earth coincide. And finally, then he gets to the number of planets within the Milky Way with whom you and I could have communication. Well, almost everybody recognizes that there is a coherence to the Drake equation, and it's a really good, healthy set of assumptions on which to proceed the search. And of course, a few years later, we get the SETI program that Frank starts along with Carl Sagan and some others. Well, a few years ago, Frank was interviewed and asked, what do you think is going to happen if contact is established? And take a look at his words. Everything we know says there are other civilizations out there to be found. The discovery of such civilizations would enrich our civilization with valuable information about science, technology, and sociology. This information could directly improve our abilities to conserve and to deal with sociological problems, poverty, for example. And my slide isn't capturing all the print here. He goes on to say how to solve the energy problem and medical advances to improve human health. I want to say ask, is that science? Or is Frank doing theology without a license? I personally hope that Frank's vision comes true. I have just been in love with the ET question and flying saucers since I was 9 or 10 years old. And this is a grand vision. I would like to see it happen. Is it science? Or is it something else that's going on here? I'm going to suggest that it's myth, and that built right in to astrobiology, as SETI and others engage in it, is a myth. And I want to sort out empirical science from mythical interpretations. One of the interesting things about Frank Drake, he's a beloved person, and 2010, our next speaker, Al Harrison, and I were invited to make presentations to the Royal Society in London. And Frank Drake was present. It was the 50th anniversary of the formulation of the Drake equation. They brought Frank up, they gave him a standing ovation, and people around the world really appreciate Frank's contribution to this whole question of ETI. Well, Frank, early on in the 1960s and into the 1970s, was very active in UFO research. And I was pleased when I first moved to California. Secretary said, "Here, I've got a message for you. Please call a man named Frank Drake." And I called him up, and he said, "Welcome to California. Maybe we could connect on this UFO business." Well, at the Royal Society, we had a chance over a glass of wine. I said, "Frank, you know, you used to really be involved with UFO research. What do you think about that now?" And he says, "Well, I abandoned it some years ago." And I said, "Well, why?" He said, "Well, it didn't seem to be making progress towards resolving the ET question, so I've invested my time in SETI." So I just report that as an interesting piece of information. Okay, now, as I said, what I want to hypothesize is that there is in this kind of thinking, both amongst our scientific researchers such as SETI and amongst many of us in ufology, a set of components that I think looks like myth. First of all, it's the inclusion of the origin of life within evolution. Both are scientific questions, but the theory of evolution has to do with speciation, how life changes from one species to another. Charles Darwin said at least 4 times in his book, The Origin of Species, "I have no idea how life began." And scientists today still don't know how life began. So evolution talks about the changes in life forms, not the origin of life. Yet you cannot justify the search for ET unless you make some positive assumption about the origin of life. The second assumption that strikes me as mythological in character is that evolution is progressive, that you started out with the simple and the dumb, and then you advance to the intelligent, and the intelligent to the scientific, to the technical, etc. I just want to say, it doesn't look very scientific. It looks like some assumptions built in there, and I'll elaborate on this if I'm stepping on your toes right now. Then intelligence leads to science, and then science will save the human race. You saw that in Frank Drake's speculation. Science will save the human race, its sociological problems, its medical problems, and even the problem of energy. I want to call this a myth based on a pattern, and you can't see it there, of what I call the Gnostic Redeemer. Let me explain that, and then we'll see whether or not it fits what is going on. Is there a new myth brewing? We are used to thinking of the human race as having developed evolutionarily over a period of time, and the future's not here yet. Will there be in our future a species more intelligent and more capable scientifically and technologically, and maybe even more capable spiritually and ethically than we are? And if so, do they live today already in an off-earth civilization? All right, let's go back to the Gnostic Redeemer myth. Take that word Gnostic. It's the Greek word for knowledge. So according to this myth, salvation comes through knowledge, and this myth was prevalent amongst the Greeks and the Romans just prior to and just after the New Testament period. And the Gnostic Redeemer story goes something like this. There was originally a divine realm characterized by light, truth, unity, and then by accident, the accidental person is called the demiurge, the physical world got created. and we fell into darkness. And in the physical world, these spiritual truths are covered over by materiality and passion and the flesh. What we need is to be saved from this darkness through true knowledge. But the good news, according to this myth, is that there lies within each one of us as a human being a little spark of the divine, a little bit of that original light. And if you can imagine, in the ancient world before Thomas Edison, fires were of special interest, because if you're around a campfire late at night, you see how the flames go up. And sometimes embers will fly up, and then the smoke rises up to heaven. And so, according to that extended metaphor, this spark from within us could be fanned in such a way that it would rise up through the various levels of darkness until it returns again to the light. And what we need, according to this myth, is a teacher, someone who will come from the realm of the light and help us to realize the spark from within. Well, there were two versions of this. One calls the spark the pneuma, or the spirit. There's another version, and that is reason, or the human mind. And that's what we get from Plato and Aristotle. And it also is the version of the myth that we get at the rise of modern science. If you take a look at Galileo and Newton, they said that God thinks in mathematics. And the natural world is organized mathematically, and God gave each one of us the capacity of reason. And so when we reason about the mathematical structure of nature, we are thinking the thoughts of God. So the modern world is founded on reason as a human capacity that unites us with the truth of all that is. So the modern science began as a form of theology or religion. About 200 years ago, God was cut off, but still this relationship between the mind and the mathematics of reality is maintained. Now, the original Gnostic Redeemer myth is vertical. You come down into darkness and you go back up into light. Could it be horizontal? I think so. I'm going to turn to philosopher Eric Voegelin here, who sees in many cultures a horizontal myth that divides history into three categories: an original paradise, a fall from paradise, and then the movement towards a new paradise. And that myth fits your and my concept of the modern world. The modern world says that the original paradise was the birth of reason in ancient Athens, and then Western civilization fell into the Dark Ages. The Dark Ages is the age of religion, dogma, rigidity, narrow-mindedness. So then with the Enlightenment and the rise of scientists such as Galileo and Newton, we retrieve the reason of ancient Athens. We embark on the era of science, and we save ourselves from the darkness of religion. Well, this concept of the modern world could only be created by those of us who live in it. Can you imagine if you lived in the Dark Ages? Suppose you're Ulugh Bek in Samarkand, the Muslim astronomer who tracked the stars. Can you imagine Ulugh Bek saying, "Oh, I feel so badly, I live in the Dark Ages"? Or St. Thomas Aquinas, University of Paris in the 12th century, saying, "Oh, I live in the Dark Ages"? No, it's only looking backwards when we want to say we are better than those people that we can create this myth of history in which gnosis or reason saves us. All right, now how do I want to use the word myth? If you think of myth as a story that's false, let me just change it a little bit. No, a myth is a conceptual set through which we interpret data. Some of us in this room wear glasses. Most of the day, you look through the glasses and they help you see things. But if somebody says, you know, your glasses are dirty, well, you pull them off for a minute, you clean them, then you become aware of your glasses. But most of the time, we're not aware of it, and that's the way myth functions, I think. We look through the myth, and I'm saying, let's pause for a minute to take off the glasses and clean them and talk about the myth. Well, the main component of this myth is, as I said, the concept of evolution. Not just any old evolution, but evolution with progress in it. Darwin himself waffled on this question. Is there progress or isn't there? And sometimes he gave in and said, yep, the human race is going to be better in the future than it is now. Is that scientific? Well, no. If you ask the world's leading evolutionary biologists, I just picked 3 of them here, Ernst Mayr, Stephen Jay Gould, Francisco Ayala, all of them denounce the idea that there is built into natural processes some telos, some purpose, some direction, some movement of progress from the simple to the complex, from the stupid to the... It's not there. Evolution is driven by the interaction of changes in inheritance acted on by natural selection. And Francisco Ayala, with whom I spend a lot of time, will say there is no guarantee that the human race is going to survive, let alone speciate into something better than us. He said you could imagine a natural disaster of the type that eliminated the dinosaurs, or perhaps climate change, or perhaps nuclear self-destruction, in which the human race would go extinct, and the insects, they would survive. There is nothing about evolution that suggests that intelligent species are more likely to be selected for endurance than unintelligent species. Now, maybe you don't like this. Well, if you don't like this, well, you just choose another scientist, right? And there are very respected scientists who say, no, that's not right. Christian de Duve, Nobel Prize winning biologist from Belgium says the universe is awash with life. We haven't found it yet, but it's there. Simon Conway Morris at Cambridge argues that evolution has a principle of convergence in there, that there are only certain alternatives that natural selection can exact, and we should expect that on other planets there will be intelligent life very similar to ours. So my point here is that the assumption that we make in astrobiology or SETI is at least controversial, not to be taken as axiomatic. And I don't know who's going to win the battle here, the no-sayers or the yay-sayers, but we certainly can't glibly make this assumption without recognizing the criticism of it. There's one more aspect about myth that I think we ought to pay attention to, and I suggested this when I mentioned the myth of the modern age, and that is, you and I, when we tell myths, like to make ourselves into the hero. So let's take a look at the Freudian myth. Sigmund Freud says there are 3 great revolutions that make the modern world what it is. Number 1, the Copernican revolution, putting the sun in the center of the universe and the earth on its periphery. Number 2, the Darwinian evolution that anchors human nature in the natural world. Well, he's got to have a third. What's that third one going to be? I wonder. It's the Freudian revolution. And he's worried about the ego. Let me say, I don't think he needs to worry about his own ego. So tell me a myth and put me in it. That's part of the dynamics of what's going on here. All right, now let's try to apply this to SETI and see what it is that we come up with. This is Jill Tarter, and for many years she was the director of the SETI project. Scientists really admire her. She's a good scientist, and she's provided excellent leadership. But let's just take a look at how she thinks about what we're talking about. The ETIs, or the robotic emissaries that we might connect with, are older than we are. That's another way of making this big evolutionary assumption that I mentioned earlier. Well, what about the fall from which we need to be rescued? What's that? Well, these are her words now. The extraterrestrial longevity is inconsistent with organized monotheistic religions on Earth. Why? Such religions are responsible for the longest lasting warfare and destruction. So we on Earth live in darkness because of violent religion. What will happen in the future in terms of getting rescued or saved from this darkness? She says there will be no sects or no religious divisions. There will be a highly established code of ethics, okay, that brings peace and tranquility. And how are we going to get it? Well, the extraterrestrials will give us the knowledge about how to get it. They may tell us how it is possible to transition from the my God versus your God conflicts to a more stable universal religion of understanding. Now, is this what you'd call empirical science? I don't think so. It's theology without a license again. Yet, look at how closely attached it is to the empirical research of listening for radio signals. I have to say that last fall, I was invited to SETI to tell them my thoughts. About 90 scientists were there in the room, and a number of them really took umbrage. When I used that word myth, oh, did they get upset? And after the discussion went for a while, one says, we got to tell myths like this. That's the way we get our funding. Okay, let's try to map what she is saying. Origin of life, that is the movement from chemistry to life, is just sort of glibly just stuck into the theory of evolution. Again, I want to say, it's not part of Darwin's theory of evolution. We still don't know how life began. We may discover it, to be sure, but the chances of its fitting into the theory of evolution, that is to say, variation and inheritance with natural selection, I think pretty low that that's going to be involved. Then we've got this doctrine of progress, and then right in here in human civilization, we've got the rise of religion, which is less advanced, and then we get the rise of science and technology, which saves us from the vicissitudes of religion, and then we can look to the future when science and technology will save us from all human drudgery. Karen, my wife and I visited a colleague, Chris McKay, not too long ago at NASA, and Chris is a Mars expert. He's one that wants to terraform Mars. We walked out of his office, and there is a giant picture hanging on the wall. I just had to take a picture of it. And let's take a look at this picture. It's called The Origin and Evolution of Life. Now, what I like about this is that origin and evolution are distinct. They're not collapsed in there. But what is the story that it tells? Well, let's start from left to right. The very early ages of Earth, 4.5 billion years ago, in which there's a lot of interaction between Earth and off-Earth bodies as we're getting clobbered with meteors and things. And then it settles down, and then life begins somewhere around here. Notice it's getting zapped by the sun. There's a whole mythological train of thought having to do with electricity, but I won't go into that in a moment. But at any rate, life begins very simply, and then it progresses. We finally get to strings of DNA, and then that gives birth to increasingly more complex organisms. Finally, we get sea animals who crawl up onto Earth, and then evolution continues. We get the dinosaur age, 65 million years ago. Then eventually we get to human beings, but evolution doesn't stop with your and my human ancestors. Oh no, evolution continues so that the human race evolves higher and higher, and then we get, notice there's a mountain here. Evolution is going upward, not sideways. It's going upward, upward, until we're just about to touch the heavens, and who's there? Whoa, the astronomers and the SETI scientists, that's who's there. It's like Sigmund Freud, tell me a myth and put me in it. A year ago, I was invited to give a paper at a NASA-sponsored conference on exploring life in the universe. Here's my section. I just want you to notice what they called it right there. How can astrobiology help save the world? Is that not theology without a license? Is that what science is supposed to do, is save the world? All right, now I want to turn to the field of ufology in light of what it is that we said, and I had suggested at the beginning that SETI scientists and ufologists should show up at the same barbecues because they have a lot in common. What they have in common is A, a real interest in extraterrestrial intelligence, B, the myth. So let's take a look at this. You probably recognize the Paul Trent photo, McMinnville, 1950. Now, if you were Francois Lagrange, as we heard last night in his analysis of photographs, you'd want to subject this to analysis. Well, if you divide it into pixels, you could tell how sharp the image of that roof is compared to the image of the flying saucer hanging there. And the Condon report, 1966 to 1969, did just that. And you know what? They said, this is an authentic photo. That's not a model hanging by a string. Oh no, that's a 30-foot in diameter hovering craft there. So they subjected it to the kind of rigorous analysis that we think is very much a part of UFO science. So that should lead Dr. Condon, a professor of chemistry at the University of Colorado, that should lead him to conclude that ufology is serious science, right? Well, what does he say in his introduction? Our general conclusion is that nothing has come from the study of UFOs in the past 21 years that has added to scientific knowledge. Well, Dr. Condon wrote the introduction. He didn't even read the research that appeared there because he didn't know how to handle the Trent photo and some of the other evidence. So there is a way in which people who engage in ufology and those who engage in standard science really think alike in terms of what counts as scientific evidence, yet in the face of that evidence, you get a contrary conclusion. Well, let's look at this just a little bit more, and this is treated very nicely in David Jacobs' book, The UFO Controversy in America. And the question is, did Dr. Condon and his researchers perform admirable science? And the answer is no. Well, how do we know? Well, among other things, there's an internal memo called the Low Memo, in which the scientists are instructed our study should be conducted almost exclusively by non-believers. Pause. Non-believers. What role does belief play in science? I'm sometimes asked by media people, are you a UFO believer? I say, no, I believe in God, but I like to study UFOs. So Mr. Lowe divides the human race into two categories, believers and non-believers. Good science. The trick, he says, would be, I think, to describe the project so that to the public it would appear to be a totally objective study, but to the scientific community it would present the image of a group of non-believers trying their best to be objective, but having an almost zero expectation of finding a saucer. I wonder why people in ufology object, as they frequently do. I see my time is evaporating here, so I may have to eclipse some of what follows. I've already made my main points. J. Allen Hynek, formerly consultant to the United States Air Force Blue Book program, was so incensed by the Condon report, he said the problem is that these scientists are not scientific enough. They're not open to where the evidence from UFO sightings and accounts might lead them. I'm going to have to be a little bit selective here. You know what, I'm going to skip this and come back to that. Let me talk about my own method here. We speak frequently of the UFO phenomenon. Well, a good way to study any phenomenon is the method of phenomenology. And the word phenomenon is based on the Greek verb phino, which means to appear, and in an appearance you have that which appears and you have the person to whom it appears. You have the object and you have the subject. If we wanted to be scientific, we'd only look at the objects. But if you're in phenomenology, you would include, well, what's going on with the subject as well? And that's where I want to put the role of myth and just include it in our study of the phenomenon of UFOs. In a couple of minutes, you'll hear from Al Harrison, who has given special attention to the role of the U.S. government conspiracy in the UFO phenomenon and to the anger that this has precipitated in the UFO community, and he'll say something about that in a few minutes. If we take a look at the UFO phenomenon as a phenomenon, we have to include not just those things that are seen in the sky, and not just the personalities of those who witness them, but the role of government and its relationship to science as well. I'm just going to have to skip what I wanted to say about Oppenheimer because I think it's important, but if you could remember 1951, World War II ends in 1945. During the late 40s, Robert Oppenheimer is asking that nuclear weapons be removed from the hands of the United States and placed in an international organization. He did not want to see the Cold War beginning. Harry Truman rejected that flatly. So 1951, you get to the first of, in my judgment, only two authentic UFO movies, The Day the Earth Stood Still, 1951, and Close Encounters of the Third Kind, 1977. All the others are science fiction. And what's so important here in this movie is how the political leaders around the world cannot deal with the problem of nuclear weapons. So Klaatu comes to us from another planet. He fails to unite the terrestrial governments to deal with the threat of nuclear weapons. And he thinks, well, if the politicians can't do it, maybe the scientists can. So at the climactic conclusion of the movie, if you saw it and remember it, I can't ask you for a show of hands because the lights are in my eyes, but I'll bet you a lot of you have seen this one. At the conclusion, you see all these scientists gathered in Washington, and they're of different races and different cultures, and the worldwide scientific community, they could deliver world peace when the politicians can't. And we have this great speech by Klaatu, there must be security for all or no one is secure. We live in peace, we and the extraterrestrials live in peace without arms or armies, free to pursue more profitable enterprises. And we could teach you, earthlings, if you only would learn. And so here we have the Gnostic Redeemer myth, all in contemporary imagery. I want to say that I think that this movie had an enormous influence on what then happens within the UFO phenomenon. The contactees of the 1950s are almost duplicates of Klaatu with regard to their messages. George Adamski, 1952, he says he meets this little guy from Venus, and they're communicating telepathically, and then the Venusian, with his hands, makes the shape of a nuclear cloud and says, boom, boom, all the way from Venus, communicates telepathically, and has to say boom, boom. Contemporary UFO cults, I would include the Raelians, the largest UFO religion right now, centered in Toronto. And Rael says, you, earthlings, urgently need to stop nuclear weapons testing. So the UFOnauts are going to bring us global peace by overcoming this threat of self-destruction. That's the Gnostic Redeemer myth at work and becoming the core of UFO-related religions. My point here is that times change, and we now have an ecological threat that we need to be saved from, and funny things, the UFOs want to save us from that as well. A number of things about Stan Friedman here that I'm going to have to skip over, but Stan's main theme is the same as J. Allen Hynek's. The scientists should be more scientific than they are, and that means they should be open to evidence that UFO researchers are able to provide. Okay, my final point, Jan Harzen. Let's take a look at some of Jan's words that appeared recently in the MUFON UFO Journal. Jan is speaking from his heart, and he's also speaking as a MUFON leader. Will man become more accepting of his fellow human beings once he realizes that he is not alone in the universe? Will human understanding ultimately reach a level where wars cease and mankind begins to look at all humanity as his brother, or to be taken care of and served rather than destroyed? One can only hope, and it is with this hope that MUFON proudly bears the mission statement, the scientific study of UFOs for the benefit of humanity. Now, I find this inspiring. I find it something that I myself can embrace. Let me, and I warned Jan about this, okay? Let me suggest that when you catch Jan with a cup of coffee, that you ask him this question. How is it that science is going to deliver all these benefits to humanity. Seems to me there are two ways to interpret this. One would be science itself, medical science, or the other kinds of advances that we're making will make human life better. That's one alternative. The other would be that intelligent civilizations on other planets have a science so much more advanced than ours and a technology more advanced than ours that if they share that information with us, that knowledge with us, then we on Earth will be able to take a leap forward. I do not know how he's going to answer this question. I told him, don't tell me. But maybe he'll tell you. Okay, final. I'm a theologian who absolutely loves science, and I love the question of extraterrestrial intelligence, and my colleague Bob and I are offering a course next spring called Astrotheology, and we're going to define it this way. Astrotheology is that branch of theology which provides a critical analysis of the contemporary space sciences, combined with an explication of classic doctrines such as creation and eschatology. Eschatology has to do with the future, for the purpose of constructing a comprehensive and meaningful understanding of our human situation within an astonishingly immense universe. So what does that mean for science? I would like to say, as an astrotheologian, clean up your science. Distinguish between what you can know empirically and what you have on the glasses with regard to myth that makes you want to so interpret your science in these salvific ways. Demythologize. Does that mean that a scientist can't speculate, can't hope? Of course. Speculation is what drives good science. And I think that the relationship between scientific research and our civilization should be characterized by hope for a better tomorrow. Finally, when it comes time for a barbecue, I would like to see the SETI scientists, and the NASA scientists, and the ufologists all enjoying it together. Bye-bye, and thank you for your attention.